Spread out. Yeah, so these. There we go. Now we're good. So the hormones are produced by endocrine tissue, which is either neurosecretory tissue or glandular epithelial tissue. The hormones are loaded into the blood. They're carried by the beating action of the heart around the body, and they bind to cells with receptors for those hormones in order to induce a response. Okay. Two broad classes of hormones are water soluble and nonpolar hormones. Okay. The nonpolar hormones are thyroid hormones, such as T3 and T4, and all of the steroid hormones, such as aldosterone and estrogen and progesterone, and so on. Okay. The water soluble hormones can be carried in the blood on their own. They don't need any special type of vehicle, while the lipid soluble hormones have to be carried by a transport globulin, which is made by the liver. All right. Otherwise, they won't dissolve well in the plasma and they won't reach their target. Okay. What happens once they find their target is that they induce a response designed to change conditions to match the command given by the endocrine organ. Okay. And once that happens, that generally causes the reduction in the secretion of the original hormone, and we call that negative feedback. Now, there are some variations in this we'll talk about. Okay. The reason that the endocrine system exists is to serve as a low energy counterpart to the nervous system, because if we use the nervous system for all the body's communication functions, we would be it would be a logistical nightmare. Okay, because you'd have a nerve ending to every single cell in the body, and you would consume massive amounts of energy all the time, right? And so it's not practical. So this is a low energy alternative to what the nervous system does, and it works with the nervous system frequently. Okay, and there are some structures that overlap between the nervous system and the endocrine system, and those include the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary and the adrenal medulla. Okay, they share structures. Right? What does the endocrine system do? Well, lots of things. Right, it stimulates growth and development, coordinates male and female reproductive systems, maintains homeostasis, and allows us to adapt to emergency demands in the body. If you look at the endocrine system, it's organized from top to bottom pretty much the way the command structure goes. The hypothalamus is in charge of the pituitary gland, which is in charge of several downstream endocrine glands, such as the thyroid and the gonads and the adrenal cortex. All are under direct control of the pituitary. Okay. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary either directly, in the case of the posterior pituitary, by manufacturing the hormones ADH and oxytocin in the brain and storing them in the posterior pituitary for release, okay, or through the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system in the anterior pituitary through releasing and inhibiting hormones. Okay, so the hypothalamus really is sort of like the overlord of the endocrine system in many ways. Okay. On the other side of the brainstem is the pineal gland, which produces melatonin and controls what we would call our circadian rhythms, our sleep-wake cycles. Okay. Underneath all of this is the thyroid gland, which produces thyroid hormone and controls our metabolism and our calcium balance through the production of calcitonin. And on the back of the thyroid gland, the parathyroid glands, which control our blood calcium levels as well by basically raising blood calcium levels. Below that is the thymus, which is behind your sternum and in front of your heart, and it produces thymosins and thymopoietins that allow our T cell population to achieve immunocompetence, meaning it can tolerate our own antigens while destroying foreign ones. Once that has happened, those T cells migrate out from the thymus and populate the other lymphatic organs, such as the lymph nodes and the tonsils and the mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue and the spleen. Okay, there's wide distribution throughout the body. Moving down, you've got the adrenal glands, which are on top of each kidney. And it's really two glands in one. There's an adrenal cortex, which produces aldosterone, cortisone and cortisol, and androgens. And there's an adrenal medulla, which produces epinephrine, or sometimes it's called adrenaline. Okay. The medulla, it's neurosecretory tissue. Okay. Cortex is epithelium.
One is muted.
Okay. The cortex is glandular epithelial tissue. So there really are two different tissue populations in one organ. Okay. And then we have the pancreas, okay, which is both an exocrine and an endocrine organ. The endocrine pancreas produces hormones that control our blood sugars, such as insulin and glucagon. Okay. And the exocrine pancreas, of course, produces bicarbonate and digestive enzymes to help us chemically break down the food that we eat. Right? And then finally, the gonads, the females, those are the ovaries, and males, those are the testes. And they are also a combination exocrine endocrine gland. Okay, the ovaries and the testes both produce and distribute gametes, right? And females, that's the egg, and males, that's the sperm. But they also produce hormones that control sexual function. Okay, in men, testosterone primarily; in women, estrogen and progesterone primarily. But remember that men and women make all three. It's just that men make more testosterone generally than estrogen and progesterone. And in women, it's more estrogen and progesterone than testosterone. Okay. So, interesting thing, right, is that you actually have two sources of sex hormones, the adrenal cortex and the gonads. Okay. So those are the main ones. There are other hormones that are made by tissues that aren't primarily endocrine. Okay, there's hormone production in the digestive system, for instance. There's hormone production in the urinary system, and so on. But we're going to cover the main classic hormones and hormone producing glands. Okay. All right. So, general characteristics, right? There are different rates and rhythms of secretion, right? Some hormones are produced diurnally, meaning they're produced differently in the day and the night. Okay. Some are pulsatile, meaning that they cycle between a window compatible with normal function. Okay. They go up and down and up and down. And patterns that depend on material in the blood. Okay. Such as things like blood sugar or blood calcium. Okay. They operate within feedback systems. Generally, these are negative feedback systems, meaning that the stimulus produces a command that causes the effector to generate effects that reduce the stimulus. Okay. They affect only target cells with appropriate receptors. So a hormone cannot have an impact on a cell that doesn't have a receptor for it. Okay. And they are excreted by the kidneys or deactivated by the liver or other cellular mechanisms. Basically, the kidneys can excrete water-soluble hormones directly or with minimal enzymatic breakdown in the plasma, all right? But lipid-soluble hormones, such as thyroid hormone or any of the steroid hormones, have to be processed in the liver by an enzyme system called cytochrome P450 so that they can be rendered water soluble in the plasma and then be excreted by the kidneys. Okay. Hormones are released in response to a change in the environment to maintain a regulated level of certain substances or other hormones. They're regulated either by chemical, hormonal, or neural factors. Okay. And they operate primarily on negative feedback. So let's give an example of each, right? Hormonal one would be the production of thyroid hormone, okay? As thyroid hormone levels in the blood fall, okay, the hypothalamus, which is connected directly to the pituitary gland, produces thyrotropin releasing hormone, which causes the anterior pituitary to produce thyroid stimulating hormone, which causes the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. As thyroid hormone levels rise in the blood, eventually that feeds back to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and TRH and TSH levels drop. And as a result, thyroid hormone levels drop. Okay, so that would be an example of hormonal control. Chemical factors. An example would be the release of insulin and glucagon, right? After a meal, your blood sugar levels go up, okay? The beta islets in the pancreas can detect this, and they secrete insulin, and insulin causes the liver to go into glycogenesis and gluconeogenesis, okay? Not gluconeogenesis, glycogen production, all right, and storage and fat storage, and it causes the other tissues in the body to take up the blood sugar to use for energy, okay? And so your blood sugar levels fall, and then once they fall to a certain degree, insulin production drops off, okay? Glucagon is the reverse. As glucagon, as glucose levels fall in the blood, glucagon is produced by the pancreas, by the alpha islets, and that causes the liver to shed glucose into the blood by gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis. Okay, and then neural control. All right, you could see at the posterior pituitary or in the adrenal medulla. All right, when you have a fight or flight response, you panic, right? The sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system fires. One of those effects is to neurally stimulate the neurosecretory tissue in the adrenal medulla and cause the release of adrenaline into the blood. And that enhances the effects of fight or flight, which, as you know, are dilation of the pupils, increased sweat production, bronchodilation, directing blood flow toward heart, lung, and skeletal muscle and away from digestive, urinary, and reproductive. Okay. An increase in heart rate, an increase in respiratory rate, an increase in blood sugar. Okay. And all of that's designed to basically get you ready to fight or to flee. Okay. So that'd be one example. What you're looking at here is just the feedback loop we discussed with thyroid hormone. Okay. This hormone that's released by the anterior pituitary, TSH, is what's called a tropic hormone. Okay. And tropic just means a hormone that has an effect on another endocrine gland. Okay. So a hormone directed at other endocrine tissue. And it causes it to either release or stop the release of its hormone. Okay. And then you see the physiological effect. Hormones are released into the circulatory system through either, generally it's exocytosis, directly into the blood, right? So all of these tissues are near a blood supply, right? The target cell is going to have receptors for the hormone. If the hormone is produced at high levels for a long time, the sensitivity to that hormone can drop, and that's called downregulation, right? So there's fewer receptors to acknowledge the effect of the hormone, and so the hormone becomes less effective. In upregulation, reduced secretion of the hormone for an extended period causes an increase in the production of receptors for that hormone, and as a result, even a small release of a particular hormone will have the desired effect. Okay. Hormones can either have direct effects or what we call permissive effect. Okay. In a direct effect, we have a setup where the binding of the hormone to the receptor results generally in a cascade of events inside the cell that produces the response. In a permissive effect, what's happening is that the hormone is binding its receptor and setting the stage for another hormone to exert its effect. Okay. So a distinction there that's important. Okay. An example of downregulation would be type 2 diabetes. Okay. In type 2 diabetes, excessive calorie consumption and inactivity lead to insulin insensitivity, basically downregulation of insulin receptor. And as a result, even though you produce insulin, it doesn't have the desired effect, and your blood sugar levels stay high. And then you have all the classic symptoms that go with diabetes: polydipsia, polyuria, glycosuria, ketonuria, and long-term effects like peripheral diabetic neuropathy and early onset blindness. Okay, and often this is related or linked to obesity. Okay, so that would be one example. Okay. Water-soluble hormones circulate in an unbound form. Some are short-acting, some and bind to surface receptors. Lipid-soluble hormones have to be bound to a carrier in order to dissolve in the blood and reach their target tissue. Okay, that's just a matter of solubilities. Generally speaking, the water-soluble hormones act on surface receptors that set off cascades inside the cell, which amplify the effect and have a distinct response very rapidly. Okay, whereas lipid-soluble hormones generally have to cross the plasma membrane of the target cell, and their receptors await them in either the nucleus or the cytoplasm. They have to form a complex, and then they have to induce transcription, and then it's the translation of the proteins that ultimately results in the response. So it takes longer. Okay, it takes longer. You could see here, right, upregulation and downregulation of hormone and how that works. Okay, there's also what happens in the brain when we have the physiochemistry of addiction, right? For instance, this is how cocaine addiction happens, right? Is that you downregulate in the brain the receptors for the opioid, right? And then you need more and more of the cocaine to produce the same effect. Okay. As we said, hormone receptors are either in the plasma membrane in the case of water-soluble hormones, or they're inside the cell in the case of lipid-soluble hormones. Okay. Water-soluble hormones are usually high molecular weight and can't diffuse across the plasma membrane, so they act at the surface. While lipid-soluble hormones can honestly go anywhere they want in the body because the cell membrane is not a barrier, and they bind to either receptors in the cytosol or in the nucleus. Okay. Generally, with water-soluble hormones, the hormone binds the receptor, and then we have a cascade of events called signal transduction that eventually generates the response. Okay, some examples of second messengers include calcium release, cyclic AMP production, cyclic GMP production, activation of a tyrosine kinase, or the use of inositol triphosphate. Okay, so let's take a look at how this works.
Peptide hormones influence their target cells without actually entering them. They bind to receptors on the target cell's plasma membrane. This will trigger one of a variety of responses. For example, epinephrine from the adrenal medulla binds to a receptor on the membrane of a liver cell. Epinephrine's effect on this cell will be the breakdown of glycogen to glucose. The binding of epinephrine to the receptor activates the enzyme adenylate cyclase, which converts ATP to cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP acts as a second messenger and sets off a cascade of reactions that activate a set of enzymes. In this cell, the enzymes catalyze the breakdown of glycogen to glucose, and glucose can be released from the cell.
That's just one example. Okay. Lipid-soluble hormones, a little bit different. This is an example with steroid hormones.
Steroid hormones are not water-soluble. They travel in the blood attached to protein carriers. When steroid hormones arrive at their target cells, they dissociate from their protein carriers and pass through the plasma membrane of the cell. Some steroid hormones bind to specific receptor proteins in the cytoplasm and then move as a hormone receptor complex into the nucleus. Other steroids travel directly into the nucleus before encountering their receptor proteins, not shown. The hormone receptor protein, activated by binding to the hormone, is now able to bind to specific regions of the DNA. These DNA regions are known as the hormone response elements. The binding of the hormone receptor complex has a direct effect on the level of transcription at that site. Messenger RNA, mRNA, is produced, which then codes for the synthesis of specific proteins.
So that takes longer, right? And the receptors are either in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus. So we'll start at the top, right? The hypothalamus is sort of the overlord of the endocrine system, with a few exceptions. And it works through the pituitary gland in order to do this, right? The pituitary gland is actually two glands in one. The anterior pituitary is glandular epithelial tissue that clings to the posterior pituitary, which is neurosecretory tissue. So the posterior pituitary is literally an extension of the brain, while the anterior pituitary is just clinging to it, okay? The communication between the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary is through the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. You can see that on the left there. So hormones that are created in the hypothalamus move through capillary bed into another capillary bed in the anterior pituitary and cause the release or the reduction in the production of a particular hormone, okay? Whereas in the posterior pituitary, the hormones are literally manufactured in the brain, in the hypothalamus, and they're stored in the posterior pituitary and released when the appropriate neural stimulus takes place, okay? Anterior pituitary produces a variety of hormones, okay? We'll go through each one. Adrenocorticotropic hormone targets the adrenal cortex. Melanocyte stimulating hormone targets melanocytes, which are pigment-producing cells in the skin. Growth hormone causes growth. That's not hard to figure out. Prolactin causes milk production. And glycoprotein hormones, including FSH and LH, act on the gonads to coordinate reproductive function. TSH targets the thyroid to promote the production of thyroid hormone, okay? Anterior pituitary also produces luteinizing hormone, okay? And that targets the gonads. Follicle stimulating hormone, which also targets the gonads. Beta lipotropin and beta endorphins, okay? The endorphins are there for, basically they have a sort of an opioid effect, okay? Posterior pituitary hormones are oxytocin and vasopressin, okay? Vasopressin, sometimes called ADH, is our water retaining hormone. So it acts to cause the body to hold on to more fluid at the kidneys and reduces urine output and increases blood volume and blood pressure. While oxytocin aids in childbirth by triggering uterine contraction and also promotes milk ejection, okay? Remember, these hormones are manufactured literally in the brain and stored in the posterior pituitary. For those who may or may not remember, the pituitary gland sits in the hypophyseal fossa, which is dead center in the sphenoid bone, right above the nasal cavity, okay? The pineal gland is near the center of the brain. It's located right above the midbrain, and it secretes melatonin, which regulates our sleep-wake cycles, and may have a role in the onset of puberty. Basically, this is a hormone that is a throwback to a time before electric light and fire. And melatonin levels go up in the dark and they go down with the light, okay? So the retina has a role in this. And the idea was that back before we could make light at night, when the sun went down, it was time to just go to sleep, okay? And that's part of what the effect of the melatonin was. It was to allow the reticular activating system to shut down the gates of perception to the cerebral cortex, so that stimuli didn't really get to our consciousness, and then we'd fall asleep. And y'all know this, right? If you're in a dark room, um, you tend to doze off if it's quiet, right? And then, of course, when the light levels go up, the melatonin production goes down, the thalamic gates of perception are opened up, and those stimuli get to our cerebral cortex, and we awaken. Okay, this is one of the reasons why it's good to have your external environment agree with your internal clock. Okay, phenomena such as jet lag and third shift. Anybody that worked third shift, you know that when it's dark out, you kind of want to be asleep, and when it's light out, you want to be awake. And when you work third shift, you have to reverse that process, and it takes a toll on your body. That's why generally it pays more. You can look at people that live up near the North Pole, where at the extreme levels you get 6 months of darkness and 6 months of light, right? And that causes all sorts of problems with drug abuse and alcoholism. Okay, so this is why this hormone is there. Okay, your thyroid gland is right under your thyroid cartilage in your larynx, and it's shaped like a butterfly. And the two wings are connected by an isthmus, and it contains follicles that are filled with a colloid that's made up of the precursor to thyroid hormone. Okay, the colloid is largely hydrophobic. That's why it has to be stored like that as a gel. Okay, the parafollicular cells secrete calcitonin, which lowers blood calcium levels and increases mineralization of bone and bone density. Regulation of thyroid hormone secretion is, as we previously discussed, right? Thyroid hormone levels in the blood fall. TRH is going to hit the anterior pituitary, cause a kick out of TSH, which is going to hit the thyroid gland and cause an increase in thyroid hormone production. And then as thyroid hormone levels rise, negative feedback will reduce secretion of TRH and TSH from the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So that's called the hypothalamic hypophyseal axis. Okay, and it's responsible to control things like ACTH release from the anterior pituitary, TSH release, and FSH and LH release from the anterior pituitary. All work basically the same way. Thyroid hormone is secreted in response to TSH production. 90% of thyroid hormone is T4, 10% is T3. The 4 and the 3 represent the number of iodine atoms connected to the hormone, okay, as it's secreted into the blood. It's bound to thyroxine binding globulin made by the liver, or thyroxine binding prealbumin, albumin, or lipoprotein. Okay. It affects the growth and maturation of tissues. In the adult, primarily metabolism and heat production and oxygen consumption. Okay. A lack of thyroid hormone production during development produces a condition called cretinism, okay, in which the child is short stature with cognitive deficit and other systemic effects. So let's take a look at how thyroid hormone works.
Thyroxine is a water-insoluble hormone that is brought to the target cell via a protein carrier. Because it is lipophilic, thyroxine can easily pass through the cell membrane. Thyroxine contains 4 iodines and is often abbreviated T4, tetraiodothyronine. The thyroid gland also secretes smaller amounts of a similar molecule that has only 3 iodines, called triiodothyronine, T3. Both hormones enter target cells, but all the T4 that enters is converted into T3. Thus, only the T3 form of the hormone enters the nucleus and binds to nuclear receptor proteins. The hormone receptor protein complex, in turn, binds to the appropriate hormone response elements on DNA. The binding of the hormone receptor complex has a direct effect on the level of transcription at the site where it binds. The messenger RNA, mRNA, produced then codes for specific proteins.
So it's very similar setup to the way that steroid hormones operate because they're both lipid soluble. Okay. The parathyroid glands make parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone's job is to raise blood calcium levels by securing more calcium from digestive, urinary, and bone. Okay. It's an antagonist of calcitonin and utilizes vitamin D in order for parathyroid hormone to do its job. Now, vitamin D, of course, is consumed in our diet, and active vitamin D is a combination of steps that take place in the skin under the influence of the sun, and the kidneys, okay, and the liver. Okay, so all three participate in making active vitamin D. Okay. You can see where the thyroid and parathyroids are. Okay. And you can see the organization of thyroid tissue. Okay. The colloid there in the middle, right, where the precursor to the thyroid hormone is stored. Okay. Then you've got the parafollicular cells. Okay. And then you've got these cells that are in between, right? These interstitial cells are what produce the calcitonin. Okay. The parafollicular's job is to break down the colloid and turn it into mature thyroid hormone, T3 and T4. Okay. The endocrine pancreas is responsible for controlling blood sugar. All right. The islets of Langerhans contain alpha cells, beta cells, delta cells. Okay. The alpha cells produce glucagon, the beta cells produce insulin. Insulin is a hypoglycemic hormone, it lowers blood sugar levels, while glucagon is a hyperglycemic hormone and raises blood sugar levels. Okay. The deltas make somatostatin and gastrin, and the F cells make a pancreatic polypeptide. Okay. So you can see the endocrine pancreas here. Okay. Under a microscope, the islets are histologically distinct from the acinar cells that produce the digestive enzymes and the bicarbonate that goes into the pancreatic duct. Okay. Insulin is made from proinsulin, and secretion is promoted by increased blood levels of glucose, amino acids, and GI hormones, and helps glucose uptake. It's an anabolic hormone because it promotes synthesis of proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Okay. Amylin is a peptide hormone co-secreted with insulin and delays nutrient uptake and suppresses glucagon secretion. Glucagon, of course, is the antagonist of insulin. Okay. Now, the way that insulin does its thing is that it acts on insulin receptors, okay, and sets off a cascade with a tyrosine kinase, okay, and phosphorylation cascades result in glucose transport and fatty acid and protein synthesis, as well as glycogen synthesis, cell growth, amino acid, and electrolyte transport. Okay. Other effects, downstream effects, cell growth and differentiation, and gene expression. Okay. So you can see here again how this is working. Okay. The transport protein for glucose is GLUT4. Okay. And is a translocator. Okay. Note that the nervous system's exclusive fuel is glucose, but it does not rely on insulin for glucose uptake. Okay. One of the things that we have to realize is that when glucose levels are low, all that glucose goes to the nervous system first, and then any tissue that can switch off to another fuel source will do so. Okay. Glucagon is promoted by a drop in blood sugar levels, stimulates glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis, and lipolysis. Pancreatic somatostatin is involved in regulating alpha and beta cell secretion. Gastrin, ghrelin, and pancreatic polypeptides are important as well. Gastrin, of course, promotes the production of gastric juice in the stomach, okay, and an increase in gastric motility. Ghrelin regulates hunger. Okay. The adrenal glands are really two glands in one. All right, the adrenal cortex surrounding the adrenal medulla. Okay, the medulla is neurosecretory tissue innervated by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system to produce adrenaline. Okay, and that's in response to fight or flight. The cortex is different. Okay, the way to remember the hormones secreted by the cortex is to remember the phrase salt, sugar, sex. Let's write that out here. Okay. So glomerulosa, remember salt, remember aldosterone, which is your salt retaining hormone. Okay. Fasciculata is sugar. Remember cortisone and cortisol. Okay, and they help elevate your blood sugar levels and suppress inflammation. And reticularis is sex, and these are androgens. Okay, so we basically have the same effect as testosterone. Okay, which are, think PED, performance enhancing drug. Increase muscle mass, increase bone density, increase hematocrit, increase libido. All of those from the effects of testosterone. That's why athletes use it and abuse it to get better at their sport. Okay. All right, so you can see the zones here, right? The different zones and the different hormones they make. Right? The adrenal cortex is stimulated by ACTH from the anterior pituitary. Glucocorticoid hormones have direct effects on carbohydrate metabolism and also suppress inflammation and growth suppressing effects. Anti-inflammatory, so they suppress inflammation, they suppress growth. This is one of the reasons why you get sicker quicker when you feel like you're under stress all the time, because you produce lots of cortisone and cortisol, and that suppresses inflammation. That makes it easier for disease processes to set in. Okay. The most important naturally occurring glucocorticoid is cortisol. This is what they give when they're giving steroids for inflammation. This is sort of what they're talking about, is oral corticosteroids, okay, glucocorticoids. Mineralocorticoid, aldosterone, okay, increases the activity of sodium pump in the epithelial cells, causes you to retain sodium and water, and thus increase blood pressure, blood volume, and lose potassium, okay. It's most important naturally occurring mineralocorticoid, aldosterone, okay. And then finally, adrenal estrogens and androgens by the adrenal cortex, okay, which secretes weak androgens, which are converted by peripheral tissues to stronger ones, such as testosterone. And of course, the medulla produces adrenaline, okay? The chromaffin cells secrete epinephrine, adrenaline, and norepinephrine, noradrenaline, okay? Release of catecholamines is part of the fight or flight response, and it promotes hyperglycemia. So you can see here all the effects. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is a big part of what aldosterone does, okay? And you learned about that in A&P, but just to review, right? When blood pressure drops, the kidneys detect this and kick out renin, which converts angiotensinogen, which is always in the blood and made by the liver, into angiotensin 1. And then in the lungs, ACE converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 causes increase in ADH and aldosterone production, thirst, and vasoconstriction. And all of that raises your blood pressure. So this is why people that are hypertensive are sometimes given ACE inhibitors, right, to lower their blood pressure and reduce the effects of constitutively high blood pressure. As we age, what happens? Well, at the gut level, what happens when we age? There's just fewer cells to do the job. And so organs lose function, tissues thin, and everything becomes less effective, okay? You have decreased secretion and clearance of hormones. You have organ atrophy and weight loss. And you have changes in receptor binding and intracellular responses. And as a result, a lot of our normal mechanisms become less effective. We have to be reminded when to drink and when to eat. Our reflexes become less effective. We get weaker. We get more body fat. Okay. It's a drag, right? But it happens in part because every time a cell divides, it loses a little bit of genetic material at the tips of the chromosomes. And once we get to critical information in those chromosomes, the cells shut down through a process called apoptosis. And when the rate of cell death increases compared to the rate of cell regeneration, that's a big part of what results in aging. Okay. All right. Let's take 15 and come back and talk about what happens